All right, well, this is Psalm 121, and I'm starting in verse 5. The Lord is your keeper, the Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. Well, we do thank you, Father, and we thank you that we can trust in you to protect us and watch over us and preserve us. And we don't always recognize it and realize it when it's happening, but certainly when we look back on our lives, we can honestly say you have never forsaken us and you have always been there for us. We ask, Father, that you would help to turn that recognition of that truth into a confidence and a faith for the future. And we pray all these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. All right, well, we've moved into studying Jacob's life. And, Jacob's been, quite frankly, having a kind of a tough time. And in last time in chapter 30, when we finished chapter 30, we talked about the fact that, it sure seemed like God is trying to teach Jacob a number of lessons, and we talked about, that there seem to be lessons about deceitfulness, about favoritism, about how things turn out when he insists on doing them on his own, on his own strength without the help of God. Lessons about morality, immorality if you want. Lessons about the results of failing to take his role as leader of the family seriously and ensuring that God's ways are his ways and God's ways are the family's ways. And I'm sure there's more. When we think about that, we start to think about the fact that, well, gee, thinking about it from that perspective, Jacob sounds a lot like us. He's had a difficult time, and that is without doubt. And when we start to see it from this vantage point, we can start to feel, really sorry for Jacob, But that's a part of the message here, is that Jacob wanted to do things his way, and he insisted on doing things his way. And even when God comes to him in a dream saying, hey, I'm going to care for you, I'm your God, you're inheriting the covenant and everything else, he really just kind of treats God as, yeah, okay, when I think about you, and he doesn't give God a priority in his life, and it hasn't been turning out real well for him. And the other point here is that God has been prospering Jacob, even though he's let him go through difficulties to get there. It's basically because Jacob insisted on doing it that way, and yet, despite Jacob himself, God has prospered Jacob. And we talked about how the end of it, that, that's an important lesson to see, is that when God promises something, like to take care of us, nothing is going to stand in his way. Nothing is going to stop him. Not the fact that our faith is less than it should be, nor that people like Laban who try to cheat us or take advantage of us or harm us are out there. Nothing is ultimately going to stop God from providing for us. That God's sovereignty triumphs over all things, including Satan. Now, it may not always feel like it, okay? And if you look at it from a worldly point of view, it may not always look like God is triumphing. But when we look at it from the big picture, we see that it is. And in that respect, we see that God is molding Jacob. We talked about at the very beginning that Jacob wanted this covenant. He wanted the blessings. He wanted them desperately. but we never really saw why it was that he wanted them. He understood they were of value, but he didn't understand what it meant relative to God and his relationship with God to have these blessings and have this covenant. Okay? And so God is growing Jacob, and he's changing Jacob to help him understand that it's not just a promise for blessings like, hey, you'll have a lot of stuff, you'll be rich, you'll be wealthy, or things like that. But remember what he told Abraham, I am your shield, your great reward. It's all about having God. And so that's what God is trying to do in Jacob, is make him aware of that. And in chapter 31, we will come to a point, we'll start to see it today a little bit, where we begin to see that Jacob is getting it, okay? But not fully. It's a slow process. It's slow for us, and it seems to be slow for Jacob, okay? But before this chapter ends, we start to see that Jacob is slowly starting to get it. Now, he's still going to be a really stubborn guy, okay? There's no doubt about that. But this is a pivotal chapter in terms of the life of Jacob, and we'll see why that all is. And part of the message is that things kind of come to a point where Jacob has to finally acknowledge and realize he's not in control. And God allows him to get to that place so that God can use it to get Jacob to see that there are problems because of the way he's handled stuff. And he starts to realize that while he gets himself into issues, there's issues that he can't get himself out of, that only God can get him out of, that he has to truly start to trust in God, and that God has been protecting him all along. And in this light, we start to see how Jacob's life and Jacob's attitude is so applicable to us. And some people get there faster, and some people get there slower. And some people's path is different than others, but we all have to get to that point where we recognize, maybe I can manage some of this stuff, but I can't manage all of it. And it's not a coincidence that God lets us get into those kinds of places. All right, well, let's pick up. It's a long chapter. I don't know if we'll do this in 2 sessions or if it'll be 3, but we'll see. Okay. Maya, why don't you read verses 1 through 3 in chapter 31 for us, please?
Okay. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you.
Okay. Let's see. Marie, would you read 4 through 9, please?
Okay. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. And you know that with all my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not allow him to hurt me. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streaks shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaks. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me.
Thank you. And Maya, how about 10 through 13?
Okay. In a breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, I understand. Here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land.
And we have 14 through 16.
Okay. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion of inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it.
Okay. So we see things starting to change within this extended family, if you will. And to put it in context, it's probably important to go back a little bit to the last verse in Genesis chapter 30. And remember, it reads, so the man, that being Jacob, became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So he's obviously done a lot of trading. When traders, I guess, come through the area, that kind of thing, and he's got all these flocks and whatever product that's coming from them, and so he's getting servants, and he's trading some of the animals for camels and for donkeys and so all kinds of things. And in that context, verse 1 of 31 becomes pretty important. So Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all this wealth. Well, I think the first question is if the sons are saying that, what do you think Laban thinks?
Oh, he's probably infuriated. He can't figure out what the heck is going on, except that he's being cheated.
Yeah.
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 He had a perfect.
Anyway.
Yeah. Everything was going just great.
Yeah, perfect.
Until the William time. But I mean, obviously they're reflecting probably what the sons and the dad have been off talking on their own, right? And some people have stated that it's maybe the way they read this is maybe these sons made sure that Jacob was able to overhear them, so that they would understand, so Jacob would start to understand what's going on. So Jacob hears this, and obviously he comes to this conclusion: hey, things are changing, and it's interesting to hear the son's take on this situation, which, as we just said a second ago, is likely identical to Laban's, right? That Jacob has stolen and taken away what was Laban's. And remember what's so interesting about that is in the chapter before, Jacob says, hey, it's time for me to go home. Laban says, please don't leave. I've been blessed because of you. And we talked about how he found that out through divination, through paying attention to evil, sorcery and stuff like that. But they work up a deal. And the deal is Jacob gets all the spotted, all the speckled, all the mottled, all the striped sheep and goats and cattle and stuff like that, and all the black lambs, probably because their wool, their hides aren't as valuable. And remember, what was the first thing after they make the deal, that Laban did?
Holding his sons go and take them all and.
Yeah, that's right. Before Jacob could separate the flocks, take what was his, and then he was going to raise them all. Remember, Laban goes down and he takes everything that would have been Jacob's and gives them to his sons to go take care of. Yeah, and they care for it. And that's in verse 35 of 30. And so it's interesting that they did that, And yet their attitude is, oh yeah, Jacob's been stealing from us.
I don't know, what gets me too is that not only is Laban doing this to Jacob, he's doing this to his daughters, and the boys are doing that to their sisters.
So we're going to get to that in a
Okay.
second. Yeah. So obviously, you know, Jacob feels differently. He doesn't see it that way. And when we start to realize it, you know, the Bible is teaching, the Bible is clearly telling us, yeah, that Laban and his sons are cheating Jacob. It's not Jacob cheating them. Okay? And so the question is, well, why would the sons think this? Well, the answer is obvious, right? It's because of how the Lord has prospered Jacob. Okay? And as I said, he's become exceedingly wealthy. Okay? Um, and apparently what is going on is Jacob's portion of the herd has grown considerably, but for these sons to have this attitude, the opposite has got to be true. The solid colored animals that are Laban's are not prospering. They're not doing as well. They're doing noticeably less well. Okay? And so, you know, because if both herds were doing great, then this animosity probably wouldn't be there. Okay? But it's not just that Jacob's are doing well, it's that what's Laban's are not. Okay? And you know, when I read through this, I thought about it and I realized, you know, well, boy, again, here we see once more, right? This incredible and honest depiction of human nature. When things don't go our way and we're not happy about it, most of the time we in our minds rewrite the facts. We're not willing to acknowledge, well, you know, it's like this because I screwed up, or it's like this because I'm not following God. It's like this because God told me to do something and I decided to do it a different way. You know, Laban knew and recognized that God is prospering Jacob. That's why he wants Jacob to stay. Now, where's the shock that if he continues in his way and the herds get separated, that Jacob's herd is going to prosper and his is not? And rather than saying, hey, maybe this God of Jacob's is the real deal and I should go and start learning about this God.
Yeah, and maybe he'll do something for me.
That's right.
No,
Maybe he really is a loving, caring, all-powerful God. Instead, let me rewrite the facts. Jacob is stealing from me. Now we're going to find out.
But I find it hard, like, how is he stealing if, because he said the spotted the black, so Jacob's got a gazillion spotted black striped.
That's the point, Maya. He's not.
No, I know that, but like, how can Laban say that if he doesn't have any solids?
Because he's dumber than the sheep.
Well, okay, but because inside of people, we have this, and you and I talked about this extensively yesterday in a different regards. People have an incredibly desperate need to justify themselves.
Okay.
And they don't want to be wrong. And so we'll do everything we can to build up walls to keep the truth and the obvious from coming through. We'll even make elaborate stories up. I mean, elaborate stories up. Oh yeah, like evolution. To help us to help us deny what is obvious. And in all fairness, okay, all you got to do is look outside in the world and you see it all the time.
I'm just thinking of the woke movement. It's not, you know, I'm poor and stuff. It's not because of the decisions that I made. It's because, you know, you did something to me. You know, now I got it. Now I need, you know, restitution or whatever.
Yeah, you know, I'm not accountable because of my decisions. You've done something that's not right. And that's exactly what's going on here. Yeah. And as I said, we see this blatant reality of human nature. Okay. Um, and by the way, why are the sons saying this? Well, let's put this in perspective. Um, Laban was there when Rebekah went off with Abraham's servant 120 years ago. Laban's an older guy. He we don't know his exact age, but he's got to be at least like 150 or something. Okay, you know, these sons are essentially saying he's stealing from us because this is our future. This is our inheritance. Okay, so basically Jacob's got everybody against him. Okay, there's another last message here, which is really sadly, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Isn't it funny how Laban's sons sound an awful lot like him? Okay, and that's still true today. Okay, and you know what? If we're honest with ourselves, it's true about us too. And this speaks to God's desire to change us, to change our very nature through a knowing and a logic and an understanding of Him, who His Word is, as revealed to us by the Holy Spirit, and the changes that the Spirit makes within us. Okay, it's really an amazing thing when you think about it, but it's God trying to change this human nature. Now, verse 2, Jacob sees that the attitude of Laban, and you might have different translations there. It's literally the face of Laban. Laban isn't looking at him like he used to. And behold, it was not friendly. It wasn't cordial toward him as it was formerly. Why would Laban's attitude towards Jacob change?
Because previously he was working the shit out of him and he gained from it, and now he's not.
Yeah, he's even when Rebecca was first there, and they said, do you know Laban? And they're kind of like, yeah, we know him. There was something wrong. Then, all his life he's done the trickery, and all of a sudden it's not working.
Yeah, isn't that's really the point, isn't it? He's always had these deals where he benefited unfairly at Jacob's expense. And this deal about, hey, you keep the solid ones, the more valuable ones, and many people think probably the more common ones, right? And I'll keep the spotted and the modeled ones that aren't worth as much. You would think, 50-50 deal, and hard to cheat at it. We're going to see that Laban does anyhow cheat at it, continues to cheat at it, besides just taking what was Jacob's at first. As long as Laban is benefiting from this deal, benefiting from the work and the labor of Jacob, he's okay with it. And now all of a sudden, it's not, there's nothing here stated that Jacob's not doing his job. In fact, Jacob clearly is doing his job. Okay, the herds are still there. Laban is still taking advantage of Jacob just like he always has. It's just that his deceitfulness and his tricks aren't working. And he's just getting ticked. Okay? Laban only cares about Jacob, his nephew, and his son-in-law, as long as he can make money off of him. And if that's not another blatant statement about human nature, I don't know what is. So we see.
It's sad too, because, like you said, indirectly, then he doesn't give a crap about his daughters.
Well, that's built in there too. You could generalize it a little bit, and you could say, literally, people are just tools to him. Mm-hmm. It's what he can get out of them. And my guess is he doesn't actually treat his sons any differently.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they, like you said, they're just like him.
Yeah. And as I said, Laban has a choice here. He can get bitter. He can get mad. He can cheat more and do stuff. Or he could say, hey, maybe there's something to this God thing. And again, human nature, how often do we see that out in the real world? We see people all the time beating their heads against the walls because their ways just don't work and they won't give up and turn to God. The message was clear. Laban preferred to consult with demons and perform and participate in the occult and to use divination. And yet here's Jacob prospering and it's interesting because when you think back about it, remember when we were reading about Abraham's life, when we were reading about Isaac's life, God used them both and helped to declare himself through them to the Philistines and to the Canaanites, to the people groups around them, remember? And here God is doing the same thing with Jacob. He's using Jacob to make himself known to Laban. But just like before, Laban is not listening. Now, this is the early foreshadowing of what God wants to do with Israel. He wants to set apart a nation. Okay, and remember that from Noah came the nations of the world, and they all turned against God at the Tower of Babel. So God is going to pull out his own nation, and he's going to use that nation to reveal himself to the nations around him. See, it's the very beginnings, and even here at the beginnings, when the nation is one guy, Abraham, and then his son, Isaac, and then his grandson, Jacob, God is already doing that. Okay? And it's important to see that thread starting to start. Okay? Regrettably, like I say, Laban and his sons reject God. Okay? And it's a hard thing to see that this story, while focused primarily around Jacob because of who he's going to be relative to Israel's history, okay, we really should spend some time also and look at Laban and say, man, this is just hard to read about. It's hard to see. Okay? Laban rejects God not because he hasn't been made available to the truth, not because he hasn't seen the facts, just because he chooses to reject God. Okay? It's not due to the fact that he hasn't had a chance or that God hasn't done everything he could do to make himself known. And in hundreds of years from now, probably like 500 years from the time we're reading about, when Joshua brings the Israelites back, okay, and they conquer these people, they have huge wars, they kill many of the Canaanites in that land and everything else, and everybody says, look how terrible it was. It's because all of these years God had been working on them, and they had continued to reject God and to sink deeper and deeper and deeper into immorality. And what God was doing was protecting them from themselves and protecting the Israelites from that kind of an influence.
But I've got a question.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say this. So Laban, he just wants he wants to prosper.
Yeah.
If people go to God just so that they prosper, God will know that's in their heart, and doesn't that make God upset with them?
God will continue to work on them.
Okay, so
Okay.
at least it's just the beginning, even though it might not be an altruistic thing,
Yeah.
that they're turning to God because they know that that's right. But hey, if I believe in God now, what will He give me?
And I think we'll see that at least at some level that's where Jacob is before we're done with this chapter. Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right. All right. Verse 3. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Do not forget that. I will be with you. It will come up again and again as we go through this chapter. Jacob doesn't get that part. He heard the first part. He doesn't get the back part. Now, Jacob has been prosperous because of God, And essentially what he has done is he has gotten the back wages that Laban has cheated him out of. Thanks to God. God has done this. Okay? And so now that he's prospered, now that he's gotten his fair wages, God says, hey, it's time to go. Now this it's a command and it's a promise. As I said, God said he would return Jacob all the way back in chapter 28, verse 15, when Jacob was leaving the promised land. He told Jacob, hey, I'll be with you and I will return you to this land. And so God here is reaffirming that initial promise, that he ensures that Jacob is going to return safely and that he will be with him and he will make sure that that happens. Okay? Now, Jacob, what we're going to read about is Jacob is going to be obedient partially. Okay? And what I mean by that is one, he's not going to really trust in the I'll be with you part, but he will obediently leave. He'll leave quite quickly. But the thing that's going to happen first is we're going to see that while he's obedient, he leaves in a manner, the manner of his departure is inconsistent with God's nature. Okay? So what we see that's coming up is that we can be obedient to God, but we can do it in a way that God doesn't like. See, even though God tells him, I'm going to be with you, I'm going to take care of you and everything else, Jacob is going to choose to leave in a deceitful manner. Okay? And that's an important thing to see here as we get going, okay? So let's keep going. So verse 4, so Jacob sent and called for Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field, which is the right thing to do, right? He's calling his wives, he's getting them, when it says, sent and called, and he's sending a messenger. He's out in the field with the animals. He sends a messenger to get Rachel and Leah. They come to the flocks in the field. And so he's going to talk this over with them. I'm not sure he's asking for their permission, although they wholeheartedly endorse what he's doing. Okay? But he does want to bring them into it so that they at least know what's going on. And in verse 5, he said to them, I see your father's attitude that is not friendly toward me as formerly, but the God of my father has been with me. What does Jacob just say right there? He's contrasting two things. What's he contrasting? Laban's treatment of him with God's treatment of him. Which is really interesting because what it means is deep down Jacob does see that God is the one who's on his side. He's basically saying, look, I've done all this hard work. He's going to get to that in a second. Okay? Your father's attitude isn't friendly to me, and yet God is still with me. God is on my side. He's contrasting Laban's treatment of him with God's treatment of him, which means he does have some awareness of it. Okay? And in verse 6, he goes on to say, you know that I have served your father with all my strength. So Jacob realizes that God has prospered him, at least at some level. Okay? But Jacob isn't really accepting God as God. Okay? Notice how he refers to God in verse 5. The God of my father. He's not my God. He's the God of my father. Doesn't that sound weird? I mean, think about that. Say it in your own head to yourself. Oh yeah, the God of my father. Well, he's my God. That's not what Jacob says. The God of Isaac, my father, has been with me, unlike your father. Okay? And we can say that while Jacob is aware of this, he doesn't actually have a relationship with God. Okay? And he says, in verse 6, you know that I've served your father with all of my strength. Now, neither wife denies that. And I suspect that's really true. Jacob has worked really hard for Laban, okay? But he's done it in his own power. He's rested on his own wits, his own abilities, his own strength, okay? And they've been difficult years because he's serving Laban in his own strength. He hasn't leaned on God. He's doing it all on his own. In Psalm 118, verse 6, we read, "The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me?" I don't think Jacob understood that kind of thought. Obviously, that psalm doesn't get written for, like 1,000 years or something like that. But the point is, I don't think Jacob gets that. 1,000 years after the writing of that psalm, or more, Jesus said, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden. I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon me and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." That's Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Jacob doesn't understand those concepts. We do. In hindsight, we get to learn from all of this. And so one of the questions that we are faced with as we study this is, do I do things in my own power? Do I rely on me? Or do I rely on God? Now, it's not all one way or the other. It's a partnership. I have to do what I'm able to. But when I can't, or when I run to the end of my limits, or when I don't know, do I go to God then? And can I trust in Him and find the rest that I need, knowing that He's in charge and He's going to take care of it? Well, he goes on in verse 7 to say, "Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me." So Jacob does, again, he's getting it at a certain level. Okay? It's interesting. Jacob does realize this, that God is protecting him. And yet he doesn't fully trust in him. He knows God is present, but he doesn't let God care for him. Okay? He's not willing to fully turn to him. He's not willing to fully submit to him. He insists on doing things his own way. He doesn't allow God to guide his path. And when we take that kind of approach, we miss so much that God desires to share with us, because what we're doing is just what Jacob is doing here. Jacob is keeping God at a distance. Yeah, I know God's doing this, but I'm going to keep trying to serve Laban in my own strength. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30, Paul much later writes, but by his doing, his being God, probably God the Father is what he's referring to, but by his doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness, sanctification, redemption. In Jesus, we have the wisdom of God. We're credited with his righteousness, even when we mess up day to day to day to day, and we say, God, I just keep messing up. How can you love me? And we get down on ourselves because we screwed up again. Remember, God sees us to be as righteous as Jesus. And as we make those mistakes, remember, Jesus is working our sanctification for us. And no matter what happens, and no matter how we see ourselves, Jesus is our Redeemer. He's bought us out of slavery to sin. Even if we fail and we sin again and again and again, Jesus has paid that price. We are redeemed. And you see, again, we've got this hindsight. We can see all that God is to us through Jesus. The wisdom that we need, the righteousness that we need to stand before Him, the sanctification to get better and to improve and to be made and molded into Jesus' image, and the redemption from the sinful life that we've got, and the what the result of that is going to be. Without redemption, without someone to pay for our sins, the penalty is hell. But Jesus does all these things for us, and when we keep Him at a distance, we don't benefit from these things. We maybe see Him a little bit, but we don't benefit from it. Now in verse 8, we start to learn some interesting things. Jacob goes on speaking to his wives, and he says, if he, that's Laban, spoke thus, the speckled shall be your wages. Then all the flock brought forth speckled. And he spoke thus, the striped shall be your wages. Well, then all the flock brought forth striped. Verse 9, thus God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. Well, isn't that interesting? Jacob actually says the same thing that Laban's kids say. God took away his livestock and gave it to me. How did he do it? Well, when Jacob says, your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, he tells us in verse 8 what that looked like. They made a deal. The spotted, the speckled, the striped, they're mine. Laban, you get the solid ones. And every time the flock started to produce a bunch of speckled ones, Laban would say, no, the speckled are mine. And he probably took a bunch of them. And then all of a sudden they would start generating spotted ones. And then Laban would say, no, all the spotted ones are mine. And he'd take more of the spotted ones. But notice what Jacob says. This is how God has done this. Okay, he says he actually has no matter what Laban has done to cheat me, God has overseen this. God has been sovereign over this, and in the process, the animals that as they have bred have become mine, not Laban's. Okay, God has done this, not Jacob. See, the sons attributed it to Jacob cheating. Jacob says, well, God gave me his herd. Yet the herd has become mine, but it's because God did it. It's not because I've cheated. Now again, we talked a little bit about this last time. It's interesting how so much foreshadowing is in the stories of these patriarchs, right? And this foreshadows the Exodus from Egypt. Now in Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 to 36, Moses wrote, and the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. And they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required. And they spoiled, some say plundered, the Egyptians. So you see, at the time of the Exodus, God ensured the Israelites received essentially 400 years of back wages that they had been owed while the Egyptians had turned them into really harsh slavery and had cheated them and everything else. And here God does the same for Jacob. And whether you see it or not in your life, whether you recognize it or not in your life, God will do the same for you. This is one of the ways God inserts a degree of justice in this life. And as we said in the past, ultimate justice will happen at the judgment seat. Okay? But there is a bit of justice here and enough for God to say, hey, I've taken care of you, and I provided for you, and no matter what these people do, it's not going to be unfair, and I'm not going to penalize Laban just because he's a jerk, but I am going to give you what's fair for you. And then Jacob continues to tell his wife something that's maybe even more interesting. And it came about at the time when the flock were mating, that I lifted up my eyes, and I saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Verse 11, then the angel of the Lord, then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. Well, how did God make this changing deal that Laban kept trying to cheat Jacob to work? Well, God just does what he's able to easily do. He prospered Jacob because the animals at that time that were by agreement going to be his successfully mated, and the animals that were supposed to be Laban's did not. Now, it had nothing to do with the striped poles in the previous chapter. God simply said, okay, Laban, if that's the deal you want to strike, you want to cheat Jacob and you want him just to have spotted, well, guess what? Spotted animals are going to breed and spotted animals are going to be born. Oh, you're going to change the deal now? It's going to be striped? Well, now I'll make sure that the striped animals successfully mate and the others don't. But do you see the irony in this? All through the last two chapters, who's been in charge sovereignly of the children and of the wives that have been conceiving in Jacob's family?
God.
God. And now he's doing the same thing. He prospered Jacob with children, and he determined which wife, which handmaid was going to conceive which child and when. And now he does the exact same thing with the animals to prosper Jacob again. Isn't it interesting to see God moving? As I said, we may not always recognize when God's providence is working in our lives. But as his children, we know it is. Now, we may not realize it until much, much later. But that doesn't mean that God's not with us, not watching over us. And here's a challenge. As we go through life, try to look at it as we're seeing it right here. Try to look at it as, oh yeah, that's God working. It's not coincidence. It's not bad luck. It's not good luck. It's God. Now, some people tell me that this is an extreme statement, and you're welcome to feel that way. That's okay with me. Okay, you're not going to hurt my feelings. But I tell people all the time this. Okay, and it's a dumb example, but I use the same one. I don't know why. I'm just set in my ways. You're walking out of the grocery store someday, or you're walking home from work, and you step into the parking lot, and there's a dime on the ground. Okay. I don't know why that dime is there, but I know it's there for a reason. I don't know if it's there for you to pick up. If you pick it up and you've got 90 cents in your pocket, I'm not saying that 90 cents plus that dime you pick up will now allow you to go buy the winning lottery ticket. That's not my point at all. My point is God is sovereign over even the little things. And when we start to think about it from that perspective, it's not somebody dropped a dime. It's, I wonder what God is doing with that dime. And it changes the way we look at everything. See, God is...
I like that example because, like, even when I find, like, a feather in the yard or a pretty flower, I always think, oh, God gave it to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't ask myself why. I just think maybe I should take it up to that level. But I'm just like, oh, look what he gave me. Or, a little broken shell of an egg.
Yeah.
from a bird's nest. I always think, oh, look what he gave to me today.
And as we go through this conversation around the flocks and whose flock is prospering and whose flock is not, don't forget that all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, God promised Abraham that he would curse those who cursed Abraham and his descendants. Ooh, look at that. God is faithful for generations. Verse 13, this is still the dream that Jacob is relaying to his wives. He says, besides that, he says, I am the God of Bethel. Remember, that's where God met him in a dream when he was leaving the promised land. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. How interesting. Do you remember what happened during that dream? We talked about it a fair bit. What was it the dream of? Remember?
Was that
It was
Jacob's
Jacob's
ladder. The ladder, right? With the angels ascending and descending, and Jacob realizes, well, wow, they're here. This is now he thinks of it as just highly localized rather than the whole earth. He sees it from a very personal perspective. We talked about that. But remember that God gave him a number of promises that he would, that he would have the covenant promises of Abraham, that he would watch over him, that he would prosper him and take care of him. And you remember, what was Jacob's vow? Chapter 28 of Genesis, verse 20 through 21. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and return me to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God.
Oh yeah, he gave God an ultimatum. You do it, and then I'll believe in you.
What is God doing? He's saying, I met your requirement. Do not forget, Jacob. You've conveniently forgotten. I've taken care of you. You've got wives. You've got sons. I'm turning them into 12 tribes. I told you I would prosper you. I told you I would make your sons, your descendants, like the sands of the seashore. I told you that I would take care of you. Look at the herds that you have. You're exceedingly rich. What is he really telling Jacob?
I kept my end of the bargain.
Now you keep your end. Get on your knees, Jacob, and start praying to me. It's amazing. Have you ever thought about that? All those times, all those years, all those many times over those years that you may have made a vow to God that you didn't think too seriously about, which is what I think Jacob did. God remembers them. God is actually saying to him, just like you said, Marie, I kept my end of it. Now you keep your end of it. I'm expecting you to do what you said you would do. Accept me as your God, no longer as just the God of your fathers. God holds us to our commitments. Verse 14, Rachel and Leah said to him, notice it's both of them, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? That's a rhetorical question. Okay, I don't think they're asking him what this is about. It's a rhetorical question. Okay, it's been pointed out that by other by many scholars and folks like that this may be the first time that two sisters agreed on anything in 20 years. Okay. And they go on, verse 15, to say, are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Well, what does that mean? First of all, it's not real kind, is it?
No, I get the point that it's not, they're not speaking highly of their father, but I'm confused.
Okay? He sold us. What did Laban do?
Sold them for work from Jacob.
He sold them for work from Jacob. He, just like you guys have said a couple times over.
Like, sort of like a dowry, though, too? Like they could give a dowry?
Hold that thought for a second. We're going to get right to it in a minute. Okay? So he basically used his daughters, not for their sake, not to grow the family, but he used them to get labor out of Jacob. What was the first thing Jacob did when he got there at the well?
Helped Leah water, or
Rachel
water.
And remember, it was a huge rock. Typically, it's a huge rock. It takes multiple people to roll it off because that way they can't get water by themselves. They have to do it jointly. Jacob rolled it off by himself. I bet he was a big, strong guy. Okay? You think that story got back to Laban?
Sure.
I think so. I think the daughters are saying they finally figured it out. He sold us just to get work out of you. Now, when they refer to themselves as being treated as foreigners by their father, that's a pretty harsh word. Go ahead. What?
I was going to say that's what made me sad. Where he said, "Are we not considered strangers by him?"
How much time do you think Laban's spending with his daughters, or maybe even his grandkids?
0.
Probably not much. He sold them. What he's really interested in is Jacob's work. See, like I say, it's a rhetorical question. Okay? Now, in verse 15, a slightly more literal translation is that Laban has enjoyed or consumed their purchase price. Now, to your point, it was supposed to be a dowry. The groom would give something a dowry. Now, it changes over time, through the generations of time. So, sometimes, actually, it's the other way around. But apparently, at this point in time, the idea was that the groom would offer some kind of a dowry to the father of the woman, okay? And part of it was to guarantee that he was serious. And part of it was, hey, if it didn't work out, if he left them, if he divorced them, if he was unfair to them, well, that money was there for her, not for the father, for her support until she could get remarried. And what they're really saying is, hey, if the purchase price for us, remember we said Jacob showed up with nothing but a staff. And so how was he going to buy, what kind of dowry was he going to give to Laban? It was his labor. And what they're saying is, he should have saved some of that. He should have saved some of the animals, some of what and put it aside for us. But instead, he's consumed it. He's used it for them. Laban only wanted wealth from Jacob, and he only wanted wealth from his daughters. They have nothing from their father. Okay. Jacob was just a means to an end for Laban, and so were the daughters. You ask yourself, how did people in that day and time feel about girls? Well, this is probably an extreme example, but it may not be the only one. Okay. They were nothing more to him. His daughters were nothing more to him than a means to an end, just like Jacob. Laban's treatment and his attitude towards his daughters has been made real to the daughters through the way he has treated Jacob and through the way that he has treated them. And they now get it. Laban is about to start reaping what he has sown. That's another part of the story here that we need to see. And again, it's so sad. Laban has everything he needs to turn to God. He has seen what God has done for Jacob. He's even realized it. He's even admitted it. He refuses to do that. He's losing his daughters. He's about to lose his grandkids. Okay, Jacob is by the end of this chapter, Jacob will have left with the majority of the wealth. He will have left with Laban's daughters, whom he's lost track of, and he's going to leave with his 12 grandchildren. At their final goodbye, Laban is never going to see them ever again. What a sad story. What a sad state. Verse 16, they go on to say, surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Interesting, not to you, Jacob. Belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you. Isn't it interesting that just as Jacob started this off by contrasting Laban with God, his daughters do the same thing. God is taking care of us, not our father. Do whatever God tells you to do. You know, in a sense, what we're really seeing here is that they're submitting to Jacob and to God. Verse 17, and Jacob arose and put his children and his wives upon camels. Verse 18, and he drove away all his livestock and all his property which he had gathered up, his acquired livestock which he had gathered in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Well, he's not wasting any time, is he? The wife said, go, we're with you. He's not going to have problems with them. So he says, I'm going. Verse 19, and when Laban had gone to shear his flock, now that's a big deal. They once a year or twice a year, whatever it is, they would go off in a separate place. They would bring all the animals in. It would be just the men. They would shear these things, and it was quite a party typically, okay? And you know, because it was a lot of work to get them all shorn, and it was the result of a lot of work from, you know, over the last period of time of shepherding them and keeping them fed and watered and everything else. And so it was a pretty big party. It was kind of like a celebration. But when so they're going to be gone for a while doing this, and they're away. And so when Laban had gone to do this, then Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. Now, if you go and you read commentaries or people's thoughts on this, a whole bunch of people will try to downplay what this is. They'll actually claim, well, they're just property markers. They're just little, you know, trinkets from around the house. And yet that's not what the Hebrew word says about them. These are idols. Okay, and very likely, and by the way, the definition of the word is that they're household idols, typically used in household worship, in household idolatry, that type of thing. Okay, there weren't necessarily priests running around. They didn't go to church, and so the patriarch, the head of the family, would periodically conduct worship lessons, and even if he didn't, he did them himself. And these idols were a part of that. These idols were probably part of what Laban was utilizing when he got into divination, you know, earlier in the last chapter, and he said this is how he knew that God was with them. Now, we don't really know why she does this, and the speculation abounds. She did it because she was ticked at her dad. She did it because she loved her dad and was trying to take away his idols so that her dad would realize what she and Leah have just said, that God is the one taking care of us, not our dad. It could be that Rachel is demonstrating some of the same tendencies of her dad. Hey, you gave us nothing, so I'm going to take something that I know is really a value of yours. Regardless, she shouldn't have done it. She shouldn't have taken them. So Rachel steals the household idols. Verse 20, and Jacob deceived Laban, the Aramean, by not telling him that he was fleeing. Well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? God outright tells us that while Jacob was obedient to leave, the way he departs is deceptive. Jacob doesn't fully trust God. God told him right there, hey, you leave and I'll be with you. But Jacob doesn't trust God enough to be fair with Laban and say, hey, we're leaving. Time is up. It's time to go. And we're going to see this in verse 31. Okay? Jacob just is afraid. He's not willing to do the right thing the right way. Now, again, it's going to be years from now, but Moses is going to write in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And Laban has treated Jacob terribly, and we've talked about it many times. And Jacob knew, even though he didn't fully get it, he knew he was under God's care. He also knows Laban is his father-in-law and the grandfather of his children, obviously the father of his wives. Jacob's family and Laban, no matter how bad Laban has been, deserved better. And so we see at this last minute, Rachel, the preferred wife, resorts to deception and thievery. And Jacob does the same thing. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, when they did this, what message did it communicate to the boys? What do you think the sons learned from this? Don't forget that, because as we go and we see them grow up and we see them starting to become, active and mature, we're going to see the same tendencies. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And when God tells us to be in the world but not of the world, He's protecting us from influence of people like Laban that might influence us and might influence our children. Some really hard messages here. We're going to stop right now. We'll pick up here next week, okay? Hang on one second. All right. Any last comments or questions, Maya?
No, I'm good.
All right. You want to pray?
Sure. Hang on. Let me just gather some thoughts. Dear God, thank you for your word. Thank you for Eric's devotion to not only you, but to us, to help us grow closer to you. Thank you for your love. Thank you for this life. Please help guide us to think, why is that dime in front of us? What does it mean from you? Help us to always understand and know that you are with us every day. But most importantly, thank you for our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.